how life is.
Draw now.
Plain text, Snapchat.
You're real hard to ask for a copy later in the paper.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
10 seconds.
We're not using this one, right?
No, I'm not.
I like Logan's sweatshirt.
It's akin to your Which resolution is in front?
Yes. Good was that one?
You should put that on the floor, dog. Or behind you. That, these things work and it'll like.
My stomach's not gonna want to eat lunch next. After drinking a monster, I don't want to eat lunch. Just make sure. Yep.
Kevin, is that plug working for you?
I don't think any of those.
Okay. I just don't want to risk my computer dying. It's not like 50%. Yeah. Chase, you don't have to.
Yeah.
I mean, that means you have to sit next to it, so.
I'll try to keep it dry.
You know,
Some
I
internet
that
stuff.
better.
Try to keep it wide as possible.
Yeah.
Brandon.
Here, can I do that in?
I'm surprised this last one.
Yeah, no, I was here. Okay.
And then the fairness.
You got those. You just gotta give me papers though.
Yeah.
Do you want to rip these up? Whatever.
No,
You got papers up.
do you have the res text? Do you have the res text your resolution? It's 9. That's good.
Okay.
In syngas infrastructure?
So this is just kind of a general request. There's a lot of people and it's kind of like a full room. Can people not debating try and stay quiet during the round? Just like to make sure nobody loses like anything.
10 of you whisper, it gets loud. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
You all ready? The resolution is the United States federal government should significantly increase its development and invest in its incentives for the development of syngas infrastructure in the United States. Inherently, the first argument is the United States does not invest in syngas in the south of the east one. Syngas is synthesized size from natural gas, coal, and other hydrocarbons. The east one is that less than 20 syngas processing facilities exist in the United States and only 3 produce energy. That's the plan. The United States federal government should offer a 100% tax credit for the construction of municipal waste-to-energy syngas facilities. The U.S. federal government should offer a 100% tax credit for the construction of municipal waste-to-energy syngas facilities. Solvency, the first argument is trash is heated in to crude syngas and refined using plasma torches. Second is the plants are able to consume over hundreds of thousands of tons of garbage per day and generate renewable metal and water along with energy. The third argument is the purely proven to solve the east one is the Plasco company in Ottawa built a plant in 2008 and was able to kick back 1 kilowatt per hour worth of energy back into the grid. Advantage 1 is syngas. There once was a place called Alcad. Alcad was where African American vets went to go after retirement. Then a city called Chicago decided to put 90% of the city's trash and all of its waste, all of its toxic waste into Alcad. It became so toxic that federal regulators who tried to see how toxic it was had their boats literally melted. Everyone had to leave. These are the devastating effects of the federal government's inaction and failure to recognize its complicity in violence. But we demand that to be stopped. The uniqueness of syngas companies want to expand municipal energy in the South with the lack startup capital. The first argument is investment has solved the east one is the firms fronted $800,000 to syngas Gas Corporation in 2003, but executives said they need a bit more incentive to assistance to explore the these one is the Sandler Research Corporation study said the trends of syngas are noted that the major challenges of investment costs. The second argument is they were huge. Trash problems in the U.S. and the South of the East ones. Municipal solid waste has increased per capita consumption per capita has increased every year since 1960. The East one is U.S. has generated 251 million tons of waste last year, which were recycled at a rate of only paltry 30%. The East one is the number of landfills is steadily decreasing, but the size has increased, which means there's more trash in concentrated areas. The East one is the large cities are the worst corporates of exploiting and ignoring trash. They, New York, for instance, exported all of its trash to outside rural areas. So links the first argument is the plan is able to cause a shift towards waste to syngas energy plants. The East one's the major corporations and industries are. There's a major conference within the industry being held this year. The plan will become the talking point and have syngas focus on waste energy. The East one is the plan incentivizes new plants and causes boom in the interest rate. The East one is also creates an incentive for these corporations who need to who want to diversify their tax structure via they have an incentive to do so via the 100% tax write-off. The second argument is the plan needs to shift away from landfills towards waste energy policies. The East one, the landfills corporations currently have 40% of landfills free space, which means there's not a ton that would have to go into the plan. The East one is that they puts a spotlight on waste energy technology. The East one is against waste and economic worth that is more than just sitting in the ground, and it also spotlights the problems of trash generally. The internal this solves trash problems. The first argument is the syngas plants are they are able to consume hundreds caused by that solvency argument. The second argument tons. The second argument is plants are built to are able to create a solvency for the majority of cities and solve their waste problems. The third argument is the impact of trash uniquely affects the minority populations. The East one is this is because landfill cities decide to put landfills on not within urban populations and cities, but rather they push them on to low-income areas and rural populations who don't have a vote. The East one is that according to the Commissioner for Racial Justice, approximately 1/2 of the First Nation peoples live in a community which has uncontrolled municipal waste sites. The East one is that the African Americans have 69% more likely to live in neighborhoods where the industrial pollution has caused greater amounts of health problems. Also, Alcad Gardens is empirical proof for this. Now, the impact level this leads to disposable populations and massive amounts of health problems. The East one is living near trash lowers but the property values, creating a cyclical poverty and cultural untouchables. 90% of black folk have become sick or live near these areas, and 65% of which are impoverished. The East one is a study that the Illinois Public Health revealed that excessive rates of cancer, brain tumors, and life-threatening birth defects are a result of these kind of trash. The East one is populations are physically cut off and rendered disposable. Trash is the trash side lagoon and outlet all prove that the East one is children of color are 9 times more likely to the economically advantaged children to be exposed to high levels lead levels, and 96% of African American children who live in these communities have unsafe levels. The frame. The interpretation is that the negative may only claim offense based on the links of the plan text. The interpretation is that the negative may only claim offense based on the links of the plan text as standards. The first argument is this: is critical to fairness. The East one is being able to generate other offense lots of negative to restart the debate in the LC and lose the entirety of the PNC. The East one is this makes the burden fundamentally possible. It gives the negative infinite offense while also giving the only thing that the only thing that going for the F, which is the access to single offense under any other interpretation. The negative gets 20 minutes of prep to prepare offense. The entirety of the block of the Afghan has to answer it in 5 minutes. The East one is fairness. It's a matter of interpersonal relations and debate space, and these are more possible than structural solutions. Yes, structures might use fairness in bad ways, but that's just an example of co-optation, which can obviously happen in non-fair structures. And we isolate two responsibilities within the debate space. The first is towards making a better world, but the second is towards each other. Any other form of debate sacrifices the second and destroys the debate community. The second argument is which side debate is fundamentally good. The East one is the F should be able to set the terms of the debate, and the negative should have to respond. The East one is this: it's key to breaking down ideological binders and moving beyond one's own limited view. The East one is the other interpretation that necessarily leads to fascism. It creates an opportunity whereby the negative thinks that they have to reveal a transcendental truth every single round, and that it is their obligation to expose the truth. But this is a form of false consciousness that necessarily re-entrenches the same kinds of structures. It also makes any solvency for any sort of critical advocacy fundamentally impossible, because the ultimate judge of these kind of ideologies is power, and those power structures are not going to do themselves unless we are able to break down by ideological blinders first. The third argument is this is key to policy education. The case of one is that preventing the affirmative from establishing a policy means that we never discuss via the United States federal government or other actors. The reason why this is fundamentally good, we will isolate a couple of reasons. The first is it's key to providing an understanding of power structures and the ways in which those permeate oppression, and the knowledge about these structures is critical to being able to actually overcome them. The reason is that the government can be good for excluded populations in a litany of ways. We will isolate immigrant populations. Immigrant populations might not have access to a vote, yet the U.S. federal government is critical to actually allowing those individuals to have access to the political sphere, i.e. via immigration policies. The someone is that fundamentally not true, that we should not talk about anything that we don't have access to. The logical conclusion of this is we only ever focus on our own personal politics, which creates a singular individuals who are disparate from one another. Think about it this way. If we never talk about something that we don't intrinsically have access to, we will never talk about the violence that happens throughout the globe. We will never talk about literally anything. For me, the violence that happens on Capitol Hill in Seattle, which is a terrible form of, we argue that this is critical for empathy, and empathy is the internally to actually creating coalitions or actually creating any sort of effective solution for any fundamental problems. Also, the ability to imagine yourself as more powerful than you are is fundamentally liberatory.
Okay. Cool. I don't know if we have time for that, but so surprise, surprise, it's going to be the criticism on top. Then I'm going to go to their framework first. Then the rest in case in order, if I have time. So that's the criticism on top. Then case, framework, then the rest of case in order. I think I'm going to deal with both. I'm not sure. I don't know where I'm going to have time for it. Those are yours.
Yep.
Is anybody not ready? All right. First off, it's going to be some counter-framework. The interpretation is the role of the ballot to affirm the team that best uses debate space to abolish whiteness. I'll repeat, the interpretation is the role of the ballot to affirm the team that best uses debate space to abolish whiteness. The first argument is we will define whiteness now. Step point A. Whiteness is a system of power that determines life chances through the theoretical or through the distribution of life chances through the racial categorization by using debaters use the performances that are coded as normal, respectable, and acceptable within the debate sphere in order to actually gain access to this. This positions debaters who criticize the system as radical or project debaters, framing as if pushing yourself against racism was a fringe belief. The B argument under this is that whiteness relies on a politics of complacency and contempt for the violence that it commits. Debaters can use this space to be able to abolish these types of advocate for the abolishment of these types of systems and use liberatory methodologies. The C argument is that liberatory methodologies provide people with the skills to be able to advocate for their own communities or resist interest convergence. Interest convergence are when benefits are supplied to those who are oppressed by white supremacy in order to maintain structures of white supremacy. Our second argument is that we are all privileged to be debating here, meaning that representational impact should be evaluated first. A sub-point is that all debate is representational. You cannot garner any impacts if it wasn't for the rhetoric and performances used to be able to gain advantage impacts, meaning that the methodologies that we use should be evaluated before the advantages we claim to solve for. The B argument is that this theoretical basis for our argument situate our performance in relationship to the power and rely on those structures for legitimacy. This is evidence in the practice of people believing that debate should happen within a vacuum, assuming that there is a space for the personal beyond the political is a symptom of white privilege. Race is a political category that's inseparable from the identity of persons of color, and the expectation that they leave it at the door is a form of violence. Our third argument is that state-based fiated performances render marginalized people invisible. This is a strategy of whiteness which we will identify as the locus of violence. The A under this is that this relies on a lens of fairness that often excludes marginalized people from being able to discuss their type of positioning. This can be seen in the so we define fairness as a question of what best attempts to address social and distributive inequity, meaning that we're always going to have the better type of methodology for being able to have marginalized narratives become recognizable under this. The B argument is that state-based solutions are unreliable. This can be seen that 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education, we are still largely educationally segregated, and the United States has broken every treaty with indigenous population, meaning that we need to question the ways in which the top-down power structure has been able to this because we are ceding our political to the state in order to actually make this violence become invisible. The thesis. Our first argument is that this debate community is an institution filled with whiteness. Our only goal should be abolish white debates. Subpoint A. Whiteness in debate structurally depoliticizes racial oppression and affects the notion that racism is not a structural issue. All NPTE classifications of what will not be tolerated include a person's color that characterized with but separate from race. This limits the discussion of race by centering it as an issue of color, an inherent part of the person's identity. This is a reductionist approach that limits the ability for people to be able to use their social location as a site of personal power. The B argument is that the logic of disassociation of racial identities constructs the ways in which we seek approval through the white participation. This means that this happens through the practice when problem solving becomes a game of conformity in order to actually join the type of system that caused the individual types of oppression within this. The C part is that the community has only gotten better at discussing the symptoms of oppression. This is the commitment to being able to solve the types of problems. Look, they're saying we need to clean up all these types of messes, but they never question why we have all this overconsumption within the first place. They never question the underlying causes for all these types of problems. The second argument is that whiteness and debate has transformed the NPTE into a geography which maps out legitimate reasoning through white privilege. The A under this is that this geography gives the materiality of history of whiteness and patriarchy within our community. This can be seen in the lack of persons of color and women in particular paints a picture of the map and produces is an unsafe space for these people. This can be seen on the left. 14 NPTE and champions, only 3 of them in persons of color, and 1 of them was a white woman. But more importantly, we never actually question the reason why they become successful in the first place or what the structural barriers are. The third argument is that we have an ethical obligation to abolish whiteness. The ace of point is that participation in the NPTE is a privilege in itself. The process of the systematic point system, the judging preferences, and the tournament selection all framed in a way to be able to produce a type of white performances, meaning that the NPTE is a critical space to be able to create an agitation for political change. So the B's, okay, so the links. The first link is going to be that the affirmative is a form of environmental racism. This factories are going to be created are going to be predominantly built in black communities. The impact of this is this makes violence invisible because we never actually question the ways in which the actions believe or this happened. What?
It's in Kentucky.
This is an example of in Kentucky of wait, what?
These factories are predominantly getting built.
Okay, mostly they're currently getting built next to coal mining areas, and this is the ways in which it is the very selective areas in which it gets produced in order to produce this type of racism. The second argument is going to be the affirmative portrays the United States federal government as a white savior. This is reading the type of narrative as a form of interest convergence because it sees the political and it says that the state is a safe place for this type of microaggressions, and the form is actually disassociation from your own personal identity. This causes interest conversion because of the ways in which it teaches us to use what type of white supremacy in order to. The last link is the third link is going to be the way you talk about your framework limits us from the type of discussion around. Because if I was a felon or other things like that, it means you wouldn't have actual access to the type of political process like you're talking about. I only have time for one question. Okay, so the impacts. The impact is that of whiteism. Whiteism is the cause of racism within the system of power known as the NPTE. Backed by the historical centerings of whiteness, the bathroom during times of segregation did not read racist only, but read whites only, meaning that we need to seek to abolish whiteness. The first argument is that whiteness in debate produces a form of microaggressions against minorities that make them feel unwanted and actively pushed out. The white commitment to the disassociation of identity forces minorities to pick between their own community and being able to be successful in this one. This is how colonizers produce interest convergence. Our second argument is that silence and spectatorship are also forms of microaggressions. This is seen in the University of New Mexico study that Chicano and Chicano students said it was equally as racist when teachers did not respond to the racist comments made in classes, the actual comments themselves. This means that silence prevents liberation in debate because it asks marginalized people to share their identity in relation to the white world. So the alternative? Vote NAURS to endorse the performance of abolition of whiteness in parliamentary debate. Vote NAURS to endorse the performance of abolition of whiteness in parliamentary debate. Solvency? First is going to be the affirmative. Abolitionism destroys white supremacy by indicting it in the public space and problematizing the inherent privileges associated with the white identity. The A argument is that you're either with us or against us. Abolitionism creates a binary where you're either actively resisting an intent on destroying white supremacy or you're complicit within the system. I'll get you to the bottom of solvency. This makes debate more accountable because the narratives can no longer just be waved away as simply playing a game. Our second argument is that we are in the politics of agitation. That our performance exposes how the NPTE practices uphold whiteness. The A is that this disrupts the narrative that whiteness is a neutral term within the power structures and the periphery and the performances we choose to participate in. This is the best way of eliminating structural racism within our community by forcing people to either pick sides, those who are willing to fight against whiteness or those who are actually participating in it. This can be seen in examples of Stephen Foster, who would travel to churches and advocate for preachers, advocate for anti-slavery, and who was forcibly beaten or removed from these types of churches. We too demand that you support the new abolitionist movement within debate, within our political sphere. Voting for NAURS is a confrontation with white supremacy. The C is going to be that even if our agitation demands the impossible, framing this experiences as we're still going to be able to advocate for new types of change, new possibilities. Yeah, question?
Yeah, so if you say that abolitionists is with us or against us and this solves all racism, how can you explain?
We didn't say it solves all racism.
We didn't say it solves all racism. We need to have a constant
solves the
confrontation.
question of whiteness within the debate.
It doesn't solve. It's confrontation with white supremacy.
So if it is, how do you describe the white supremacy that was present in the abolitionists?
Yeah, the abolitionist movement may have had problems, but that term has been reclaimed by people like Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X and is ultimately recentered over the last 150 years because there's over 300 abolitionists during that time period.
Especially with things
So
like the
maybe-
I don't have time. The last argument on the solvency is that we are framing the experiences as only framing as experiences the individual or skin color ignores the type of systematic involvement within the problem. Abolitionism is a method to be able to solve many of these problems by targeting whiteness as a system of privileges within our community. This allows for us to be able to promote self-reflexivity in personal politics and engage in political action. So on to their framework. First is going to be, you're going to be preferring our interpretation of fairness because it's going to give the best methodology to be able to create more equitable types of debate space within this because we need to actually look about how the system actually creates a type of disparity of the actual amount within this. Additionally, they said we need to be able to have policy action and they give the documented example, but this does not explain for the felons or other people like this who strategically get excluded time and time again from the type of political process, meaning that they're never going to be able to encourage any of this type of apathy or empathy or other things like that. They're only going to encourage further apathy, assuming that the state will be able to solve these types of problems, that this has to be the central location. Look, they're going to be saying that they're solving all this type of racism by reading their type of narrative and this predominantly affects the people, but the problem is they never look at where the production starts or how to be able to stop other types of environmental racism, meaning they don't solve.
The order will be our framework, and then it will be their framework, then the alternative, and then the links and thesis on top of the links.
Thesis on top of the links?
Alright, I didn't.
So alt and then case review.
So is it your framework, our framework, the alternative, thesis, links, impacts?
Yeah, and there will be another auth on top of the alt page.
Alright.
And I have a lot of answers to the alt, so you might want to put another piece of paper.
So two new.
So it's going to be an off on top of the alt, and then a dump on top of the alt.
Yeah.
Okay.
So 2 off.
Alright.
Sounds like a plan. Thank you.
Can you repeat the order one more time?
Bad joke. Our framework, their framework, 2 off. The alt, and then the case review.
My job, shut up.
Ready?
We win in a world of their interpretation of fairness. They concede that the ability to engage within policy systems and implement ourselves in structures of power, even if we do not have the ability to actually do it within the real world, is the internally forming advocacy skills that spill over into the real world and allow us to actually take responsibility for our subject position. You've conceded that the three dissents to your framework. The first is our standard about switch side debate. You've conceded that we can move beyond a limited view and that fascism is the alternative. That when the negative gets all ultimate truth, they become the transcendent preset that require a confession via the affirmative of our guilt, which indicates that we would never be able to resolve the question of the violence that we are complicit in a constructive way. The next argument is you've conceded that policy education is important, and that in a world of their interpretation of the way in which debate functions, we never discuss the United States federal government, which means that we never get a knowledge about the way in which power structures are actually are interacted with in a real world fashion, i.e. in a world where we are always only opposing structures of power. We never actually get to understand how our opposition functions within those structures of power, which indicates that we must be able to interact with the system of power first. We've also conceded that while immigration that immigrants might not be able to vote, we must allow these people to imagine themselves as voters in order for them to be able to understand why they might want to vote in the future. Don't have time for a question. They have also conceded that Martin does not have the ability to feel empathy in a world of your interpretation of how ethics works, because he is from Capitol Hill and he has no problems within his life, so he can't care for anyone else in a world of your interpretation. In order for people like Martin, who have a great degree of power within the world because they have money and privilege and stuff like that, they must be able to expand their vision and understand the way in which they are affected by things that do not directly affect them, which indicates that which indicates that imagining the way in which we interact within power systems is the most liberatory form. They've also conceded the third and last step to their framework is in a world where we are able to imagine ourselves within structures of power. That is the most liberatory experience we can have, because even if when we leave this room we don't have the ability to make calls upon the state, while we are in this room we do have that power, and that is a constructive use of our time within this room. Go to their framework. Our framework proves that we are able to meet. We are able to win the debate within your framework because we use the debate space by interacting with structures of power to best abolish whiteness via our arguments about how interacting with the policy systems leads to spillover insolvency without or outside the round, but also how it leads to our ability to interrogate whiteness within the round. That will become important next. That the argument about how representations are good is absolutely irrelevant to the context of whether you evaluate the PMC, because our representations indicate that interacting with the policy systems is good in an ethical way to engage with the world, which indicates that we should be able to resolve a large degree of their offense. And they see the power project teams are on the fringe of the status quo. I will answer that later. They say the debate in a vacuum is bad and it causes whiteness. That might be true, but we are recognizing privilege in the 1AC, which indicates that we do not understand debate in a vacuum. Additionally, we will win offensive arguments on the alternative, which will resolve this question. You say that fairness is whiteness. We are winning another standard range. Well, they say theirs is key, the best method. Links to the plan would allow you to interrogate the USFG.
Yeah.
They say that theirs is the best method, but links to the plan would allow you to interrogate the United States federal government, which would solve all of our offense. You do not do so, which means that you fail to meet this burden. Go to the one off there first, or I mean, the counterplan text permutation or the permutation text code. Affirmative to embrace the discussion of the tenets of whiteness outside of the round vote. Affirmative to discuss the tenets of whiteness outside the round. This is able to resolve the entirety of their offense because it allows us to resolve. It allows us to interact with people in a more serious way. The first argument is that seriously, you can come talk to us outside of the round, and we will be willing to discuss this with you. You have not made that choice so far. They have said in previous rounds that the women tournament crew said we are not able to solve whiteness within tournaments, but they still have not come to talk to us, which indicates that if they were serious about their argument with you, they would engage with us outside of the round. They have not done so, but the counterplan allows for that to happen. The next argument said this discussion would be more valuable as the community because it would allow the
tens of people sitting in this room to engage within the discussion and actually contribute to the discussion, which allows a greater variety of engagement and a larger variety to break down whiteness view. The next argument is that there are no time limits outside of round, which destroy the quality of the educational discussion, and we don't have access to the diverse mechanisms of alternative forms of research, like different articles, different theories, things that we don't know about within this round, which are available outside of round, which is another net benefit of the counterplan and a disadvantage to their interpretation. Also, there's no reason why there's no reason why we would ever reject your ideas when we are not competing. This precludes genuine engagement with your ideas. We do not want to read whiteness, but people end up or whiteness bad. People end up reading Nietzsche and debate bad. These arguments are not responsive to your claim. They do not resolve the questions of whiteness, which proves that your formulation of engagement does not solve. Also, people never go around talking about why they lost rounds, which means your solvency ends where the door is. People just say, NAU1, how do I answer whiteness? That does not mean that we are solving whiteness outside of the round. The next argument is that it creates a hierarchical dynamic whereby they assume the role of the priest, and we must confess over our sins, which is violent, and it gives them moral purity, which precludes the ability to understand the ways in which their own ontology might be flawed. Additionally, all of our policy and discursive engagement within systems of power is also offense to this counter. Go to next one. Race wars. Ace of point. Whiteness is addressed by the community, and largely ace of point is that the community that forms community forms exist at every tournament. This one will have one bar. The ace of point is that there's unanimous agreement that race disparity in the pool is fucked up in the status quo. The ace of point is that race is discussed in the context of the topic of the status quo, like our affirmative, but also systematic and structural poverty in the context of whiteness and environmental racism, CLS, etc. The ace of point is that these discussions are happening in the best way possible since nobody is reading whiteness good in the status quo. And the B argument is the links. The first is that either representations are sticky and we get our offense, or you do not solve any of your affirmative. The first link argument is that you polarize the debate community, eliminate middle ground, and alienate potential supporters. The proof of putting is the policy community proves that winning the NPTE would literally be the worst thing that could happen to your movement. It literally led to the fracturing of their community into quote-unquote race teams and quote-unquote traditional teams, which has led to a new form of segregation whereby people of color have their own tournament and the white PRL has their own tournament. This is obviously the worst form of education. Teams are literally cutting whiteness good cards, which no one in the party community does in the status quo, which indicates there is a danger in a world of your action. The next argument is that it alienates supporters, people like Nate Cohn and Andy Larson, who deny racism in any context or forced out and harassed in public forums like Facebook. Personal attacks preclude their ability to add their voices to the movement within the debate space, which indicates that you are taking away from the ability of people who would not co-opt your movement to work with you on this, which indicates that there is literally no ability for you to win anything other than the C subpoint, which is the impacts causes an overt, violent, and destructive conflict, which is not the transformative kind that would actually allow us to confront issues of whiteness in an attempt to eliminate them or in an attempt to transcend them. And instead, it leads us into direct confliction, which is not the kind of thing that they isolate solves. Instead, it is the kind whereby there is literally a war and people get injured both emotionally and physically in this world, which indicates that you are not able to resolve this in a world where we're winning uniqueness on this question. And it's offense. The next argument is the outing, disad, personalizing debate leads to a race at the bottom. For example, a debate between Nigel and Gander proves this in a round of Oregon Case T. Nigel says that he's Mexican and Hank outs Matt for the first time in order to equalize this kind of debate. This kind of debate system is obviously a race at the bottom, and the worst form of education about exclusion initially excludes those who cannot or choose not to come out of the closet. This concerns outside of their safe space, stay at home, because they fear retaliation. This is impossible because of the spread of information on the internet and Facebook. People cannot come out here because it is a safe space, but there are other spaces that are not safe. Additionally, we cannot talk about our experience at the women's tournament because we fear retaliation, which proves that not everyone has access to your debate space. Then the next disadvantage, monolithicizing inflation between between the black body and the black identity. Maybe all black bodies have black experience, but not all black experiences are had by those with black bodies. This causes essentialism and forces over-identification with claims, which justifies claims like race traitors and denies those who perhaps inwardly do not outwardly identify with your movement. People of color identify with a particular way on the political spectrum. For example, the next is the class disad teams in the Northwest that have unfunded debate programs, but not necessarily for schools like Boston and Bellevue have a lot of diversity both in terms of race and gender, but don't have the money to travel, don't get experience or credibility within the community, and are not able to debate hard teams, which indicates that there are alternative causalities for the reasons why there are low numbers in the community in the status quo. Additionally, you engage in whiteness because you use speed, jargon, and speech conditions of whiteness. They will say that this is key to empowerment, but if their co-optation arguments are going to be true, that they are co-opting those people in their movement who, in the real world, believe that debate is one such liberal, moderate device of co-optation, which means that there's literally no reason you would not vote for it.
Cool. Their framework, our framework, the links, the permutations, the first. So I have the first disad on one page. That's like the whiteness community, which leads to the impacts of violent conflict. And then the other disads, starting with like race to the bottom, ending with class dissat, I just have that on another sheet. So that's how I'm going to do that. Our solvency, our thesis, our impacts. Again, the affirmative framework, the negative framework, the link sheet, the permutations, community dissat, rest of the 3 dissats on another sheet, our solvency, our thesis, our impacts.
Your framework first, right?
No, yours. However you started the framework debate, so I'm sorry. Everybody good? The affirmative is rooted in the United States federal government ideology of what a community is. You do not answer what happens to fellows within this debate context, which means even if you are a citizen and within the system, you do not get to participate in it. There is not an answer as to if you don't have access to the system, what is the benefit of knowing how to be within the system, because that is not applicable knowledge, which is reasons that's why the negative is an impact to the affirmative on the framework. They say that the ability to engage in power structures is the internal link to advocating for these skills, but if the skills that you acquire are not applicable to your life, then what is the point of acquiring those skills first? We should actually look to create community building, look at the system program in New York City that ultimately had to deal with police brutality to the community engagement, because the police would not stop the brutality on those bodies because they did not care about people of color. You can cross-apply our third framework argument that ultimately instances of United States federal government action with minorities are unreliable. We've broken every treaty with indigenous populations, and we are still segregated after proper supportive education, which means you should question the durability of the affirmative. The next argument is you say switch side debate would ultimately lead to fascism, but you say that there are people who literally cannot switch sides. That is the argument on our thesis, that you say that there is a space for the personal beyond the political, for the personal and only in the political, which is the form of seating your agency of the state. Ultimately, that means that your arguments about switch side debate are not relevant because there are literally people who cannot switch sides because of the way in which their personal implicates their political. It's ultimately a reason as to why this is a term, because you create microaggressions when you advocate for these types of things. Ultimately, turns back the entirety of the affirmative. The next argument, you say the policy education is important. It's important for fucking who, man? If you don't have access to the policy or the programs, then that education seems nebulous because it's never be contextualized, which means that you only create a form of debate that is ultimately exclusionary in its method. You can cross-apply a framework argument that the method must come first because it is the representation, and the method is how we garner the impact, which means in a world where the United States federal government, that means you are behind on the framework questions. The next argument is you say that immigration is forget about that, but they should still imagine themselves within the border. How fucking stupid does that sound? If you are undocumented, which way should you learn to work within the system if that is not knowledge you can never apply to yourself? You should learn to work within your community. That's our thesis argument, and when you don't, you disassociate identity, which ultimately is the internal link to microaggressions within the debate space. The next argument is that we don't allow people to feel empathy, but you concede arguments that say that your form of empathy is not actual empathy, is that form of apathy, because you do not seek to destroy the privileges that created the problem in the first place, which is actually the definition of apathy, because empathy would say you are an abolitionist because you empathize with the problem and see a necessity to kill it. The next argument is you imagine the structure of power and is not liberatory within the room. All your arguments about the United States federal government, if methods comes first, that means that you created microaggressions within the room. That is the most proximal, because we can never know how racism is going to affect the structure. Trayvon Martin didn't know that he was going to walk to the grocery store and get shot for Skittles and Arizona iced tea, which means that predicting racism in terms of fiat is unpredictable and unreliable reasons. That's why we're ahead on the framework. Our framework. You say that there's spillover within the debate space, but your spillover there is necessarily bad. You can cross-apply the felon's argument here in a world where you create a method that is not necessarily inclusive. That means that the spillover that you have to the outside of the room is one that's bad. You can cross-apply your example that says that we would train people how to deal with white supremacy instead of abolishing it, which means that you are an inevitable impact of microaggressions, not only inside the round, but outside of the round. The next argument is you say that you should evaluate the PMC. That's fine, but you can see that methods come first, which means that you evaluate the method of the PMC versus the method of the negative. Ultimately, reasons that's why we're still ahead in this debate. The next argument, you say that you recognize privilege. That only allows people for people to contemplate their white guilt, but does not get a motive for them to seek to abolish it. That is the problem that we actually in the thesis. We are really fucking good about talking about the problem, but we really suck at addressing it. It's probably a reason as to why you lose debate in the world where you say you simply recognize the privilege and do not seek to abolish it. The next argument is that you say that we have links to the plan, so you can see it over links, which is reasons as to why it's a link to the plan. You ultimately lose the debate and all the permutations, because the links come with this set of the permutation. All of our links are structured around what you do with your plan text. Is the reason as to why you lose this debate. The links. Any risk of a link means that the permutations don't function in this debate round, and you automatically lose for your engagement. You can extend that you are a form of environmental racism because all of these factories get built in black communities, which means that you never solve that for the problem. That's our framework argument about unreliability, which means you are not a durable solvency. But the next and most important is that you are a form of white savior. The disassociation that you create through the narrative is ultimately a form of white supremacy, because you say this is the only system we can participate in, which is the logic of whiteness. It says that people of color should not have access because they don't have participation, but they should at least learn how the white people are fucking them, which is probably a reason as to why we are an internal link to your arguments. Permutations. First permutation discussed out of the round. First argument is turn. You depoliticize racial oppression within the debate space. All of our arguments are our thesis of the way in which the NPTE and this debate space ultimately formed racism, not outside of the round. That is the interpersonal interaction arguments that we say. Discussing this out of the round just allows people to say, hey, I'm not racist. I have black friends. I hang out with Robert. It's probably a reason as to why we should question the ways in which we create racism and microaggression within this debate space. We are ultimately most proximal because we can only affect how we interact with each other within the debate space. Ultimately, focusing it out of the debate space does not solve for the oppressions or the impacts of the negative isolates because they are proximal and contextualized to how we debate. The next argument is that when we are discussing is also ultimately a form of contemplating white guilt. That's our thesis argument. We can only discuss, but we never have a method to solve for the problem, which ultimately means that the impacts of microaggressions are inevitable in your permutation because that means that you did not develop a method for discussing these things. The next argument, you said we don't have genuine engagement, so we get engagement. We are the most genuine engagement because we force people to choose whether or not they are white supremacists or for the movement from the get-go. This ultimately solves back for all forms of co-optation. You can see how the CIA infiltrated the Black Panther movement. No, not on the time for a question because there were people who literally said that we are down to break down white supremacy, but ultimately those were CIA agents who only co-opted the movement because we did not question their methodology to begin with. The next argument is, do you say that we have no means to solve it because the people don't question why they lost the round? They don't question the lost round because their white imagination doesn't allow them to question it. This is very fucking simple. You can see the links. And your method is bad, which is why you lose the round. There's plenty of people here. They'll know why. This said, your uniqueness is non-unique, bro. Oh, that's our thesis argument that we are already discussing the problems within the debate community, which is the reason as to why you have no access to your link arguments. Go to the links now. You say that there is a representation. We polarize people. That is necessarily good. You concede all of our arguments that we must first determine what side you are on before we can ever let you be within the coalition. We do not need white supremacists within our abolitionist movement. We need two good people who are actually dedicated to the abolition. That is the historical context of abolitionism. You can cross-apply our Stephen Foster example. There's one dude instead of a bunch of churches that ultimately solved and created transformative politics. Our politics is that of agitation, which is a reason as to why the link argument is close on our side, because this is actually good that we do that. You said we create personal attacks. No, we don't. We indict your method, which is not a part of you as a person, but rather the choices that you try to make within this space, which is ultimately better because you have the choice of participating within whiteness. We don't say that you're automatically white because of your skin color. We're looking at the power politics and not not identity politics, which is a reason as to why when you choose the method is ultimately a reason as to why you question you. The next argument is that you say that this leads to violent conflict. Again, non-unique people who are trying to abolish white supremacy already feel violent conflict. The question is violent conflict for who? If you are a white person and you feel like you're being attacked because you use methods of white supremacy, it's probably good that we're doing that because we force accountability. That's our solvency argument, which means we have a bigger impact than you do because in a world where we force accountability, we create more ethical debate spaces on the other dissents. You say this is a race to the bottom. All our argument is going to be no, that it's not. We are interactional. All our argument is going to be is that whiteness, although the problems of whiteness have ultimately fractured movements, which is why we should concentrate on this first. You look at the second way feminism and reasons as to why womanism started because black women felt that their voices were being heard in a way in a intersectional lens, and ultimately the schisms themselves apart in order to conflict whiteness and allow for them to incorporate in other movements, which means that we're ultimately solving back this question. Besides, your method is not a race to the bottom, which means that this is not an impact within this debate round. The next argument is, do you say that we're a monolith and people like race traders ultimately experience the black body? No, they do not. If you are white and you are a white trader and you are a race trader, you are still identified as whites within the court. That's why John Brown's court case, he was ultimately allowed to do ridiculous shit, like just indict the government, and nobody ever told him to shut the fuck up because he was white and not black. Is probably a reason as to why your whiteness is still a form of privilege. The next argument is, you say that we are tolerant causality. That is not a reason as to why if whiteness is bad, we should still continue to abolish it. That is the white imagination that continues to perpetuate the cycles of whiteness within the debate. It's sad that we should have some back for it even if we know it's bad. You say that speed is a condition of whiteness. There is not an argumentation or an internal link as to how that is. Even if it is a condition of whiteness, people of color must use it in order to communicate with you to solve the abolition of whiteness.
Alright. Cool. So I'm just going to keep it in the same order Brandon did. So that's the affirmative framework on top. Then I'm going to go to our link page. Then the permutation. Oh, wait. Hold on, I gotta organize my papers. Okay, so the order is the affirmative framework, then the negative framework, then the permutation debate. Put the links in there before. I'll start from the beginning. F framework, neg framework, the links, the permutation page, then their disadvantages they read on ours.
Give me that one more time.
Yep. So affirmative framework, negative framework, negative links, permutation, and then ratios. All right. Everybody good to go? This debate comes down to two things. It's first a question of your representation, how you choose to be able to do that, what you're trying to do with your case. The second is the methodologies. You're endorsing a state action and saying this is solvent for all the marginalized people's voices, that they need to get incorporated into the system. This is the type of interest convergence like we're trying to talk about in terms of they're limiting us out of the round in terms of saying there's only one right way to debate. On the line by line specifically, you can extend Brandon's analysis about how people with felons don't have operational ability within the system, but there's other times when the state fails, you need to be able to have solutions for yourself or within your own community. This is the example of sister to sister and why they'll never be able to have accountability within the future. Even if you're not buying that, Brandon's next argument is that when you say we need to see the political of the state, this is the type of microaggressions. This is going to be the biggest impact of the round, and we have a solid link of how this is happening. They're saying that we have to do the statist paradigm, and we have links of why the state creates a separation of the identity. We have one because this is going to outweigh any of their fairness claims or any of their ability to be able to solve structural racism. Because it creates the type of push out that we're talking about, and we should be able to criticize your method. Look, he says that as long as this framework is only talking about links, we generate solid links and the member does not touch them. They lose the round because of this. When they don't engage on the link level, this means that they get absolutely no offense because of this framework. Anything else you need? On our framework specifically, first, our argument is that when felons don't have the ability to be able to engage within this means you're always trying to create an interest convergence and be able to incorporate people within this. So you say that we're saying that methodologies first, and this is how we have solid links to the way your methodology creates a problematic results within this. So I think I set my timer for 5 here. So
This is at 7,
okay.
so you get your done.
Okay, so this is why I always want to be preferring this. This is additionally, they completely dropped that state-based solutions are unreliable. This means that they have no durability in the future to be able to say they're solving the issues with production or these types of problems. They may be able to put a band-aid on it, but the person is still bleeding out through that area. This is the ways in which they're never able to cause long-term solvency within the future. We're both acting on right now on how we influence ourselves within the debate community. The problem is what they're doing is they're saying we have to have a statist model and there's only one way to be able to do this. What you're saying that you need to be able to question the ways in which communities can function to be able to go against this. Links. Either link means you lose. When you say that this is built specifically in target communities and never deals with the actual reasons why environmental racism happens in terms of the pollution and waste, where that waste continually gets put. When they keep talking about there's 11, the number of landfills is going down, this is what we are talking about in terms of the white neighborhoods can continually push these types of ideas out and never have to deal with this type of conformity. Even if you're not buying that, the way that they're saying is a white savior is the type of interest convergence because it assumes the state will be able to solve all these problems. On the permutations, first permutation is just a bad idea because it's the type of depoliticization that we're talking about. Look, we've already recognized the ways in which there are problems within the community. It's now a question of methodology of what we are doing with that. Is the way abolitionism creates the type of agitation that we are talking about, creates attention to be able to create change for these types of problems. This is the ways in which we're the most proximal within the round because we can not only just change our own self to be able to do this, but more importantly to do this. Brandon's analysis about how the CIA co-opted type of movements is exactly the analysis. We have a warrant on our side versus nothing on theirs, how they won't get co-opted within the future. If you allow everyone in your organization, this allows for people to say, I'm not a racist, I'm a rather without questioning the type of methodologies or other things you use. This allows for people, the system to be able to appear post-racial and informed guilt. On the race wars, this is currently happening. What we're talking about is there types of, that's important to be able to actually have representations within this. This is our Stephen Foster example that even if you get the shit beaten out of you, even if you are constantly in fight, we don't claim to solve all racism ever, but we were trying to say that we need to have a constant tension with it. We need to be a constant fight within this. This is why even if we're demanding the type of impossible, what we're saying within our solvency, that we still have a better idea of being able to fight systems of repression rather than assuming that we'll be able to do this. This is how they're always depoliticizing the type of debate and why they'll never be able to help. Where additionally, our form is always going to have the best type of accountability, and that goes conceded within the round of how we'll be able to create the most accountability because it's the way in which people engage within here as opposed to just nebulous impacts. Even if you're not buying that, there's I'm saying that this the outing disadvantage is not going to be doing this. This is a question of methods and representation. What are we doing in here? How are we doing it? And where does that get us? The abolitionism creates the type of tension that we need. It creates the ability. Look, they're never going to be able to solve with their type of status solutions, and even it might sound like a good idea, it's never going to be able to link incrementally to any of the type of possibilities they're talking about. We are talking about the push out that they're talking about, and them trying to limit us into this type of scenarios, the type of limiting felons that currently happening within the United States government. All these reasons I urge a negative ballot because they're never going to be able to solve for the space when they're claiming the bad methodologies. I'm glad I caught that 5.
Okay, the order will be the out-of-round counter plan, the SAD, we read, then the framework debate to resolve.
The framework debate starting with yours and ours, or just yours?
Maybe yours. If I make out those.
So again, Martin, real quick.
The order will be the out-of-round counterplan, the
dissad.
That we read. When you say disads, you just mean race war, or do you mean the other disads on the alt page?
All of them, just
Okay.
like that.
Okay.
And then the frame.
Our framework is an impact on microaggressions. We do not need to win that. You do not need our interpretation, but it is still a net benefit to the accountability because we impact turns the idea of dissociating your identity. It's key to empathy and it's key to taking a liberatory approach towards politics, which are cold conceded arguments out of the accountability. They have a couple of arguments for why the all-around accountability is bad. One, they say that the racism happens within the NPTE. You have conceded our entire solvency mechanism, i.e. the amount of time that we have out-around accountability allows us to solve back for the violence that happens within the round. We will be able to resolve the whitewashing. We will be able to discuss it and fundamentally solve back for it. You've conceded a litany of unique arguments which indicate that these forums have been productive, like the forum that we had at Women, or the non-competitive debate rounds that we had at Women, whereby we talked about productive solutions, but they did not have to be tied to the ballot. Those are a litany of examples that are better and more productive discussions. You say it leads to whitewashing because I can just say I am friends with where we are not responsive to all of our unique arguments to indicate they are nationally genuine. But if this is true and that the community is really so not genuine and willing to risk into race issues, then why would your project solve this? Feeds into all of our solvency arguments, i.e. people go out of this round, they say I lost you because a judge sucked in the flow. They don't say I lost you because I have a problem with white privilege. It just proves that there is neither no solvency or for our side, either side, or that we are better for. You say no microaggressions will be impact turned on the framework argument. You say that with this is a form of contemplation of white guilt, and we do not create a method to solve the problem. Obviously, the outer accountability would be a preferable method. You have conceded that the lack of time limits allow for a better method, the lack of dispute, etc., and those things that jargon that get in the way of actually forming a productive solution or a form of whiteness in themselves because they obscure the problem is comparatively better out around because we don't have to use those tools of oppression. Those can never be literary cooptation arguments. You say that we solve for all forms of cooptation because we don't allow the CIA in this argument. Doesn't make sense because you have to have some form of coalition since it will be articulated on the solvency mechanism. Otherwise, the people within power can never be broken down because a single person is not going to beat the CIA. They are simply too goddamn good. And you have conceded, and you have conceded many reasons why we also would be vulnerable for cooptation. No reason why outright confidence would lead to that. You say that there's no white imagination. This would be terminal solvency deficit too. It would be a reason why white people would never be able to go out of their own. You can see the critical argument, which is that the win and the loss necessarily destroys the transformative potential of the alternative because it turns your alternative into a game that people necessarily backlash and react against, and negative ways in order to destroy the transformative potential. Do not make me reinvent the wheel here. There was not answer to these arguments. They read parallel solvency deficits, and that takes it out entirely now, but it needs to be there was no answer to uniqueness. Your thesis, just saying the thesis is not sufficient. You can see that there was a universal call to address these kind of calls, things within the community. There was an entire tournament in one half of it. We seeded every single ballot to talk about these goddamn issues, and we have continued to do that when we were asked to seed a ballot, when we were asked to seed a ballot and do a coin flip at the Pacific tournament. We actually did this. Everyone is genuine. People walked out of rounds to have a discussion forum. Do you seriously think you were winning the uniqueness of this debate? No, you were not. And there was literally not a reason but why in round case there disassociation, which would impact her. You say that this is just more palatable and that we need there only needs to be only one white supremacist. I think the NACO and Amy Western example is perfect. And your entire thesis is that we need to expose privilege and get rid of the ways in which privilege gives things to certain individual bodies. How does that happen if the privilege never listened to you? Seriously, what is the transformative potential? One church member then got a bunch of people to agree with him, and that's how Martin Luther King got a civil rights movement, not by alienating him.
Point of order. I understand he's grandstanding, but any description of what Stephen Foster did for abolitionism, or how, incorporation of churches, or anything dealing with offensive reasons as to that, should have come out of the member, because that's clearly in the shell.
Look, your argument in the shell is not flagged as only one person is needed to solve all problems. We do not need coalitions, and if you destroyed coalitions, that'd be fine. That is not what the argument's flagged as. That's what it's articulated as the MO. I can answer.
It's under consideration.
You've also conceded that you have the empirical argument that creates fractions in the community, which creates new forms of segregation, where by the black debaters and the white debaters are fundamentally separate. There was no reason why you were able to overcome this, and you've conceded uniqueness that it doesn't happen now. That would be next disadvantage. You have conceded that the outing form of the MO in necessarily creates a hierarchical dynamic where by you ask for people to give up their identity, you ask for people to present the kind of privilege that they have, and then you agree. Yeah.
The tension on the resources that is not productive.
Yeah, the tension on the racist argument is not the productive kind. It snaps the entire community you have, and you have conceded the hierarchical dynamic, which internally turns your entire argument, because by acting as the gatekeepers of privilege, you fundamentally bring forward a new type of privilege. It doesn't matter who is the privileged or what their skin color is. It matters whether they are controlling life choices. You've conceived that hierarchical dynamic to naturals, or it is really awesome. It proves how productive discussions within debate never happen because it comes to a race to the bottom, and you say, we solve because of your method. No, this is an answer to your method. I've already saying that the alt causalities is that at least terminal soft evidence is now a good case. We have an impact on microaggression. One, you should default to the proximate impacts that we were talking about, which are more articulated than their theoretical microaggression. We talked about how specific people being outed is uniquely painful and uncomfortable for them, and that seems to outweigh the just disassociation is bad because it's bad. That is tautological and not actually explained. Outing people and forcing LGBT members, etc., to disappoint their social location, which could then get back to the family and cause empirically proven violence is far better or worse. But you can see this, which I make arguments, which is that we never take off.
Okay. So he's going for the argument that we create personal attacks and like there's harassment on Facebook, kind of. I understand that narrative. I think that it would have been an important internal link to make inside of the member that these personal attacks happen because we out people's identities. I only have that there's like interpersonal shit happening on Facebook and that personal attacks happens, but I do not have the description that is because we force you to identify and that your outing of your identity is what causes that shit on
One of
Facebook.
our disads was called outing disad, and that was the index.
No, that's a pretty fancy look.
All that analysis should have been.
Now,
You can call it what you want. It's not there.
they make 7 arguments here. The entire thesis is that people do not have access to these power structures, but we're not going for the orientation towards those power structures. We're going for the counterplan. There's no argument why the app has to be conditional, but that orientation can't be conditional. Second, you have conceded that the lack of empathy makes it impossible for you to have a program. Third, you have conceded that disassociating yourselves is liberatory. You may get to imagine yourselves as in power, as the white person who has all the power, and that is fundamentally good, doesn't lead to microaggressions. It's the exact opposite.
Okay.
Don't do it.